I've had my share of unsettling experiences, from sensing a mere presence to witnessing full apparitions. Sometimes I'd hear whispers, other times a heavy silence would fill the room. But the figure with the mask was in a realm of its own, a terrifying encounter like no other. It began when I was startled awake by a low, rumbling laugh. By then, I was all too familiar with the suffocating sensation of sleep paralysis and immediately recognized the feeling. I prepared myself for another night of eerie wakefulness when, to my horror, the door creaked open. A figure entered, wearing a mask as crimson as freshly spilled blood. The mask had a fiendish appearance, with tusk-like fangs protruding upwards, its cheeks contorted into grotesque shapes, and a furrowed brow that seemed to deepen with every moment. But what disturbed me the most were the eyes. They were an unnatural shade of violet, serpentine and bulging, as if ready to burst from their sockets. The figure was draped in a rich, deep brown cloak, the hood drawn low, casting a shadow over the rest of his face, making the mask and those terrible eyes the focal point. He dragged a writhing burlap sack behind him and stopped at the foot of my bed, his gaze locked onto mine, and after what felt like an eternity, he reached into the sack. One by one, he pulled out the faces of everyone I had ever loved or cared for. Each time, he positioned them so I was forced to look into their eyes. With a twisted, bony hand, skin stretched so tight it seemed ready to tear, he traced a long, sharp nail across their throats, spilling streams of blood at my feet. I was helpless, watching the life drain from the eyes of everyone I had ever known. In their gazes, I saw a chilling blend of terror and sorrow. When the sack was finally empty, he dropped it carelessly and began to circle my bed. He paused as he loomed over me, leaning down to gently stroke my cheek with his blood-stained nail. Then, with his other hand, he slowly removed his mask. Words fail to capture what lay beneath that mask, a face that constantly shifted, contorted, and transformed into ever more grotesque and horrifying forms, each more terrifying than the last. As I stared into those serpentine eyes, he spoke to me. The words are etched into my memory, but they were so deeply disturbing and personal that I won't repeat them. Yet, the final thing he said still echoes in my mind. Cherish the time you have left, for soon your life will be mine, and your soul as well. And as he spoke those words, his face settled into a final, chilling form. My own. I experienced a number of unsettling sleep disturbances in the late 80s and early 90s. As I remember, they began during my college years when I would occasionally take naps between classes. I figured at the time that they were triggered by light filtering through my eyelids, rousing part of my brain while leaving the rest in a fog. One of my earliest experiences occurred on a Saturday afternoon. I had returned from the campus cafeteria to my dorm room and soon drifted off to sleep. I was alone in the room, and before falling asleep, I could hear people in the hallway. Someone had brought a cat into the dorm, which was quite unusual. I dozed off, but when I thought I had woken up, I found myself completely unable to move. I was convinced the cat, which I hadn't seen or heard directly, but only heard others mention outside my door, was lurking just beyond my vision, ready to pounce. Despite my efforts, I couldn't move a muscle. Then, somehow, I fully awoke and reality snapped back into place. Of course, there was no cat in the room. These episodes continued sporadically over the next several years. The last one I recall was by far the most frightening and happened about 5 or 6 years after the one with the cat. By then, I was living in Texas but had returned to my home state for a visit, staying at a friend's house. One morning, while my friend was in the shower, I thought I had woken up but couldn't move, and I distinctly heard 2 voices. They sounded sinister to me at the time, speaking about me in harsh, threatening tones. I couldn't see them, but I could feel their presence, and it was terrifying. I desperately tried to call out to my friend, but no sound would come out. Then, I snapped awake, and the voices vanished, leaving only the sound of running water from the shower. During one of the most troubling periods of my life, I woke up in my room with an overwhelming sensation of pressure and a deep sense of malevolence. It might sound like a cliché, but the air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if some dark presence was lingering nearby. Although it was the middle of the afternoon and the room was well lit, the feeling was unmistakable. I found myself in that strange state where my mind was fully awake, my eyes were open, but my body was frozen in paralysis. I stared at the entrance to my room, gripped by fear, for what seemed like an eternity. Then it appeared. A figure began to slowly stagger through the doorway, a frail, ancient woman with hollow eyes, long gray hair, and a skeletal frame. Her skin clung loosely to her bones, and she was completely unclothed, with sunken ribs that made her appearance all the more unsettling. As she moved clumsily toward me, I was overwhelmed by a profound sense of dread. There was an unmistakable sense of something deeply unsettling about her presence. With every step she took, I felt as though she was trying to draw closer to me in a way that felt disturbingly intimate. It took every ounce of strength and willpower I had to force myself out of this nightmarish state as she drew nearer, almost hovering above me. It was like something out of a horror film, reminiscent of the way the Dementors in Harry Potter were portrayed years later, draining the very life from their victims. I struggled to break free, and with great effort, I managed to let out a yell that began as a faint whimper before finally becoming a desperate roar. As I regained control of my body, the woman vanished. The transition was seamless. Everything else in the room remained unchanged, except for the lingering feeling of dread, which slowly faded away. I was deeply shaken, wondering if I had merely lost the ability to perceive whatever had been there once I was fully awake. In an attempt to shake off the vile sensation that clung to me, I took a cold shower, hoping to cleanse myself of the lingering unease. Since then, I've done a considerable amount of research into out-of-body experiences and have come to believe that during our darkest moments, there are entities that are drawn to us. I was astonished to discover that the phenomenon of the night hag or nightmare is not uncommon. Whether these beings truly exist is a question with many possible answers. My advice to anyone who is tormented by such experiences is not to underestimate the power of ritual and personal resolve. I've experienced sleep paralysis since childhood, and like many families without scientific knowledge of the condition, I was exposed to all sorts of explanations, demonic possession being the most frightening of them all. When I turned 14 and started exploring information on the internet, I discovered that this was a fairly common experience for people with overactive imaginations or those dealing with high levels of anxiety and stress. So, I said goodbye to fear and welcomed a new perspective. As a kid, I often felt a sense of unease, as if someone was watching me. There was the familiar weight pressing down on my chest and, occasionally, the unsettling sight of shadows in the room. Although these episodes were frightening, they were relatively mild. Not too long ago, I was working on a project with a tight deadline. I finally went to bed at 3 a.m., knowing I'd have to wake up by 5 a.m. to continue working. My mind was still racing, though my body was utterly exhausted and tense. I was fully aware that I might have another episode of sleep paralysis since I had become quite adept at recognizing the signs. However, I also knew how to manage it, so I wasn't too concerned. Then it happened. I was in my room but couldn't move. I slowed my breathing and tried to focus on something else. Suddenly, I began hearing voices, whispers and mumblings with startling clarity. Then, I felt the bed shift as if someone had sat down. I could feel fingers slowly tracing from my bare leg up my side, finally stopping at my cheek. It was a slow, deliberate, and firm caress. All the while, the voices grew louder, and I lay there, unable to turn my head and see what was on the bed with me. I woke up in a state of utter terror and looked at the clock. Only 20 minutes had passed. I wasn't alarmed by the voices or the sensation of being touched, but by the fact that I had never experienced auditory hallucinations or the distinct feeling of something solid touching me during an episode of sleep paralysis. I'd had vivid dreams before where I could taste, smell, feel pain, and more, but nothing like this had ever happened during sleep paralysis. I was terrified that I might have been awake and experiencing the onset of something far more serious, like schizophrenia. It shook me to my core. One evening, as I was drifting off to sleep, something strange happened. My arm seemed to slip through the bed. Of course, my physical arm remained on the mattress, but the sensation was unmistakable. Normally, when this occurs, I just lift my arm back up, but this time curiosity got the better of me. How long would this sensation last? I began moving my arm around experimentally, and soon enough, my shoulder started to sink through as well. This was new and it was thrilling. I wiggled my fingers, then swung my arm about more energetically, feeling emboldened by this peculiar experience. Deciding to push the limits, I deliberately tried to lower my head through the bed. To my surprise, it worked, but what I encountered was nothingness. Not darkness, but an actual absence of anything. It's hard to describe, but it was as if nothing itself existed in that space. I know this probably sounds absurd, yet I sensed there was something out there, further away. With fear nowhere to be found and my curiosity uncontrollable, I decided to reach out for whatever it was. That was a big mistake. My leg began to slip, then my torso followed. My other arm went next, and soon my hips were sliding in two. Just as my left leg was about to go, I suddenly realized that whatever I was reaching for wasn't something I wanted to engage with. Panic set in, a terror as intense as the fury I sometimes feel during sleep paralysis. It was a fear unlike anything I'd ever known. I tried to pull back, but I was powerless. I attempted to kick my leg up to anchor myself, but it felt as though I was being pulled into a void. My other knee slipped, leaving only my foot and part of my left hip keeping me from completely disappearing. I was convinced I was about to be lost, whatever that might mean, but just when I thought it was over, something grasped my shoulder and pulled me back with incredible force, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The hand felt solid, strong, like it belonged there. It yanked me up as if I weighed nothing at all, and I slammed back into my body with a sense of finality. It was as if the universe itself declared, "There's no way I'm letting you fall into that." My first experience of sleep paralysis was in junior high. I am 30 now, and it has continued to sporadically occur throughout my life. Worst experience I've ever had happened after I graduated high school and moved into my grandfather's old house after he passed. I had a couple of roommates who were out, and I decided to take an afternoon nap. I knew as soon as I shut my eyes what was going to happen, but I never could have imagined how intense it would be. The music I had playing in the background began to morph until it was nothing but the sound of unknown voices screaming and crying in pain. I had fallen asleep on my side, facing a pair of doors leading into my walk-in closet. The doors slowly began to creak open and give me a glimpse of complete darkness surrounding a pair of ruby eyes staring gleefully at me. As the doors continued to open inch by inch, the piercing cries intensified and I was able to pick out the word hell being repeatedly screamed. I managed to jerk myself out of it just before the doors opened halfway, and I wasted no time bolting out of bed to the safety of my front yard. Feeling the sun on my skin and seeing the neighbors' kids playing in the street had never felt so good. I used to get sleep paralysis quite a bit when I was in high school. I guess school was stressing me out. Most of mine were just auditory and sensory hallucinations, and I've never seen anything, thankfully. I think the worst one that I experienced was when I was in bed laying on my side facing the wall with my back to the rest of the room. I have a queen bed, so there was quite a bit of room left. This was towards the end of my sleep, so like I woke up in my dream and felt this terror wash over. There was this indention next to me like something got onto the bed. I had a squeaky bed too, so I heard that clearly. I was absolutely terrified at this point, just clenching my eyes shut, and this thing is like hovering its face right by mine, and I can feel it breathing on me. It only lasted a few minutes but felt like forever at the time. It's one of the worst things I've ever experienced. The brain is amazing. Everything else is creepy garbled voices and the feeling of something on you. I got to the point where if I felt it, I would just wiggle my toes and fingers to get out of it. Please drop a like and subscribe to the channel for more horror stories.